In the quaint village of St. Mary Mead, a chilling murder shocks the sleepy streets. Percival Wren, a revered antique collector, is found stabbed in his shop. A priceless Elizabethan goblet stolen from its stand. Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp mind and quiet ways, unravels a web of secrets. Clara, the loyal assistant, hiding her fears. Hargreaves, the envious rival, with a deadly grudge. Mrs. Elton, a customer obsessed with treasures. And Thomas, the estranged son drowning in debts. As clues like a wax smudge and a broken quill emerge, Miss Marple stitches together a tale of greed, betrayal, and rage, revealing a killer in a heart-pounding race to the truth. Chapter 1. The shop on High Street. The village of St. Mary Mead lay under a pale October sun, its cottages wreathed in ivy, and the air sharp with the scent of fallen leaves. At the heart of the village, where High Street curved past the church, stood Mr. Percival Wren's antique shop, its bow window cluttered with treasures that glinted faintly through years of dust. A tarnished brass bell jingled above the door, and within, shelves groaned under the weight of chipped porcelain, gilded candelabra, and faded tapestries. Miss Jane Marple, her frail figure bundled in a woolen shawl, often paused on her walks to peer inside, her sharp eyes noting the gleam of a silver teapot or the curve of an oak chair. She had never entered, but she knew Mr. Wren's reputation, a fastidious man, shrewd in his dealings, with a knack for unearthing rarities that set collectors' hearts racing. On this particular morning, the village awoke to a clamor that shattered its drowsy.com. Cherry Baker, Miss Marple's young maid, burst into the parlor, her cheeks flushed from running. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's dreadful," she gasped, clutching a tea tray. "Mr. Wren's been found dead in his shop, stabbed, they say, with one of his own daggers. And that fancy goblet, the one he was always boasting about, it's gone." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused, her mild blue eyes narrowing. "Dear me," she murmured, setting her wool aside. "Stabbed, you say? How very curious." By noon, the village buzzed with speculation. Miss Marple, sipping her Earl Grey, listened as Cherry relayed the gossip gleaned from the baker's wife. Mr. Wren had been discovered at dawn by his assistant, Clara Phelps, who'd screamed loud enough to wake half the street. The dagger, an ornate piece from his collection, had been plunged into his chest, and the Elizabethan goblet, a silver chalice said to be worth a king's ransom, was missing from its velvet-lined stand. The shop door had been locked, the windows undisturbed, yet the thief had left no trace. "They're saying it's one of 4, Cherry went on, her voice low with excitement. "Clara, who worked for him, that Mr. Hargreaves, the other collector, who hated Mr. Wren's guts, Mrs. Elton, some rich widow who was always in the shop, or young Thomas, Mr. Wren's son, who's been nothing but trouble." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythmic click, her mind already sifting through the names. Clara Phelps, a quiet woman with a knack for polishing silver, had seemed devoted, but devotion could hide darker currents. She recalled a housemaid in St. Mary Mead who'd smiled sweetly while pilfering spoons. Mr. Hargreaves, whose own shop, in the next village, was less prosperous, had a reputation for envy, his ruddy face often twisted in scorn at Wren's success. Mrs. Elton, with her ostentatious hats and endless questions about antiques, might have coveted more than she admitted, and Thomas Wren, estranged and sullen, had been seen lurking about, his inheritance perhaps a motive. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "People are so very careless with their passions," she said softly, almost to herself. She rose, smoothing her skirt, and decided to take her afternoon walk past the shop. The street was alive with whispers, villagers lingering near the police tape as Inspector Craddock's men bustled about. Miss Marple, her black handbag swinging gently, paused at the window. Through the glass, she glimpsed the chaos within: an overturned chair, a scattering of papers, and the empty stand where the goblet had gleamed. A very particular theft, she thought, noting the undisturbed shelves around it. Not a robbery, but a choice. She turned away her mind, already threading together the village's secrets, as delicate and intricate as the lace on her collar. Chapter 2. The scene of the crime. The autumn light filtered weakly through the leaded panes of Percival Wren's antique shop, casting long shadows across the cluttered interior. The air hung heavy with the musty scent of old wood and polished brass, overlaid now with the sharp, metallic tang of blood. Miss Jane Marple stood just inside the doorway, her small, bird-like figure almost lost in the dimness, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. Inspector Craddock, a lean man with a weary air, had invited her to view the scene, knowing her knack for noticing what others overlooked. "It's a nasty business, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low as he gestured toward the body. "Not a sight for the faint-hearted." Percival Wren lay slumped across his oak desk, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, a dark stain spreading across his tweed waistcoat. The dagger, an ornate piece with a hilt of twisted silver, protruded from his chest, its blade catching the light with a cruel gleam. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on it, noting its place among the shop's treasures, a Renaissance relic. She recalled Wren boasting once at a village fete, said to have belonged to a Florentine noble. "A curious choice for a weapon," she murmured, her voice soft but clear, so very deliberate. Craddock nodded, scratching his chin. "Found this morning by Miss Phelps, his assistant. She says she locked up last night at 6, came back at 8 this morning, and found him like this." Door was still locked, no sign of forced entry. He pointed to the empty velvet stand on a nearby shelf, its polished wood stark against the surrounding clutter of porcelain figurines and tarnished candlesticks. "That's where the Elizabethan goblet sat. Worth a fortune, if Wren's claims were true. No fingerprints, no smudges, clean as a whistle." Miss Marple stepped closer, her sensible shoes silent on the worn rug. The shop was a labyrinth of relics, mahogany cabinets stuffed with yellowed letters, glass cases glinting with jeweled snuff boxes, and shelves sagging under leather-bound books. Yet the chaos seemed oddly ordered, as if Wren's meticulous hand had arranged each item just so. The desk, however, told a different story. Papers lay scattered, an inkpot tipped over, its contents pooling like a second wound. A brass paperweight, a heavy thing shaped like a lion's head, had rolled to the floor, and a single quill pen lay snapped in two. "A struggle, perhaps," Miss Marple said, her eyes narrowing, "but not a long one." Craddock raised an eyebrow. "You think so? Looks like he was caught off guard. One thrust, clean through the heart. Coroner says he died around 10 last night, give or take." He gestured to a constable, who was dusting a nearby cabinet for prints. "We've got 4 suspects so far, based on who was close to Wren. Clara Phelps. The assistant, she's shaken, but she had keys to the shop. Mr. Hargreaves, that rival collector from Lower Mead, had a row with Wren 2 days ago over that goblet. Mrs. Elton, a customer, was here yesterday afternoon, haggling over a vase. And Thomas Wren, the son estranged, mind you, and in debt up to his ears." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, her mind already threading through the possibilities. She recalled Clara Phelps, a pale, nervous woman who hovered at Wren's side during village events, her hands always busy with a cloth or a ledger. Mr. Hargreaves, by contrast, was a blustering figure, his florid face a fixture at auctions, his envy of Wren's finds barely concealed. Mrs. Elton, with her penchant for gaudy brooches and endless chatter, had been a frequent visitor, her admiration for Wren's stock almost feverish. And Thomas, the wayward son, had been spotted slinking through St. Mary Mead, his eyes shadowed with resentment. A curious quartet, Miss Marple said, almost to herself, each with their own reasons to linger here. She moved to the empty stand, her gloved fingers hovering over the velvet. The wood was polished to a mirror sheen, the dust around it undisturbed, as if the goblet had been lifted with surgical care. No fingerprints at all, she asked, glancing at Craddock. None, he confirmed. The thief knew what they were doing. Wore gloves, likely. Or wiped it clean after. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the surrounding shelves. A jade figurine stood inches away, its surface dulled by a fine layer of dust. A silver candelabrum nearby bore the same faint haze. Yet the rest of the shop is untouched, she said. Not a robbery then, but a theft with purpose. The goblet was the prize. She thought of a village jeweler years ago who'd staged a break-in to mask the theft of a single ring. The goblet's absence felt like a statement, not an afterthought. Craddock led her to the back of the shop, where a narrow door opened to boxes of unsorted relic ivory combs, chipped teacups, rusted spurs were stacked haphazardly, but none seemed disturbed. A small safe stood in the corner, its lock intact. We checked it, Craddock said. Ledgers, some cash, a few minor trinkets. Nothing missing, far as we can tell. Miss Marple nodded, her gaze catching on a faint scuff mark on the floor, near the door's threshold. It was slight, barely a smudge, but it suggested a hurried step. Someone left in haste, she thought, filing it away like a stitch in her knitting. Outside, the village was stirring. A small crowd had gathered beyond the police tape, their whispers carrying on the breeze. Miss Marple recognized Mrs. Price, the baker's wife, her apron dusted with flour, as she murmured to the postman. Heard Clara was sweet on Mr. Wren, Mrs. Price was saying. Never left his side, poor thing. But that Hargreaves he was green with envy over that goblet. Said it was a fake, but everyone knew he wanted it. Miss Marple's ears pricked, though her face remained serene. Village gossip, she knew, was like a skein of wool tangled, but full of useful threads. Craddock escorted her back to the front, where Clara Phelps sat on a stool, her hands twisting a handkerchief. Her eyes were red, her mousy hair escaping. It's pins, Miss Marple, she said, her voice trembling. I can't believe it. I locked the door last night, I swear. I checked every window. Whoever did this, they must have had a key. Her gaze darted to the floor, avoiding the desk where Wren lay. Miss Marple sat beside her, her manner gentle. Now, my dear, tell me exactly what happened. You locked up at 6, you say? Clara nodded, her fingers tightening on the handkerchief. Mr. Wren was still here, working on his ledgers. He said he'd lock up himself later. I went home, had my supper, and came back this morning. The door was locked, but when I opened it, her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands. Miss Marple patted her shoulder, her mind noting the girl's distress. Genuine, perhaps, but she recalled a young woman in St. Mary Mead who'd wept convincingly while hiding a stolen brooch. And you saw no one else yesterday? She asked. Clara hesitated. Mrs. Elton was here in the afternoon, fussing over a vase, and Mr. Hargreaves came by, arguing with Mr. Wren about the goblet. He was so angry, his face all red, but they both left before I did. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to Craddock, who was questioning a constable about the dagger. She rose, moving to the desk once more. The scattered papers caught her attention. Bills of sale, mostly, and a letter half-written in Wren's precise hand. She leaned closer, her spectacles glinting. The letter was addressed to a London dealer, mentioning the goblet's provenance. Most curious, she murmured. A single word stood out: authenticity. Had Wren doubted the goblet's worth, or was he defending it? She made a mental note to ask Craddock about the dealer. The inspector joined her, his notebook open. We've got Hargreaves coming in for questioning this afternoon. He admits to the argument, but says he was home by 7. Mrs. Elton claims she left at 5, and Thomas Wren says he was at the Red Lion pub all evening. We're checking alibis, but it's a small village. People notice things. Miss Marple nodded, her mind drifting to a long-ago theft in St. Mary Mead, where a gardener's alibi had crumbled under the weight of a neighbor's casual remark. People do notice, she said, but they don't always understand what they see. She glanced at the dagger again, its hilt intricate with filigree. That dagger, she said, was it always kept in a case? Craddock frowned, consulting his notes. Clara says it was in a locked display case, near the desk. Key was in Wren's pocket, we found it there. No sign, the case was forced. Miss Marple's lips twitched faintly. A locked case, a key in the victim's pocket, and yet the dagger had found its mark. Someone knew this shop well, she thought, or planned very carefully. She stepped back, her eyes sweeping the room once more. The scuff mark by the storeroom, the undisturbed dust, the snapped quill, all small things. But to Miss Marple, they were like stitches in a pattern, each one essential to the whole. She recalled a village doctor who'd overlooked a patient's symptoms, dismissing them as trivial. The smallest details, she'd told him then, are often the loudest. As Craddock escorted her out, she paused at the door, glancing back at the shop's dim interior. The goblet's absence was a puzzle, but the dagger's presence was a story, and Miss Marple was determined to read it to its end. Chapter 3. The Assistant's Tale, the Vicarage Garden. Bathed in the soft glow of a late autumn afternoon was a haven of clipped hedges and fading roses. Miss Jane Marple sat on a cushioned bench, her knitting a soft tangle of cream-colored wool. In her lap, as Clara Phelps perched opposite, her thin hands clasped tightly. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, had insisted on tea, and a silver tray gleamed between them, bearing a pot of Darjeeling and a plate of scones. Clara's eyes, red-rimmed from crying, darted nervously toward the vicarage windows, as if expecting Mr. Wren's ghost to peer out. Miss Marple, her expression one of gentle concern, offered a scone. "You've had a dreadful shock, my dear," she said, her voice as soothing as the rustle of leaves. "But a cup of tea can work wonders. Now, tell me about your time with Mr. Wren." Clara took a sip, her hands trembling slightly. "He was a good employer," she began, her voice low. "Strict, mind you, but fair. Taught me everything: how to spot a Georgian spoon from a Victorian one, how to clean ivory without cracking it. I'd been with him 5 years, ever since I came to St. Mary Mead." Her gaze dropped to her lap, where her fingers twisted a frayed handkerchief. "He trusted me with the shop, gave me a key. I never imagined." Her voice faltered, and she pressed the handkerchief to her lips. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a steady rhythm that seemed to calm the air. She noted Clara's pallor, the faint lines of strain around her mouth. The girl was no beauty, with her mousy hair and plain features, but there was a quiet competence about her, a quality Miss Marple had seen in many a devoted servant. Yet she recalled a housemaid in St. Mary Mead, years ago, whose loyalty had masked a simmering envy. "You must have been very fond of him," Miss Marple said, her tone inviting confidence. "He relied on you, I imagine." Clara nodded, a flush creeping into her cheeks. "He did. I handled the ledgers, polished the stock, greeted customers. He'd spend hours in the back, studying his finds. That goblet, he was so proud of it. Said it was from a noble house, maybe even a queen's table." Her eyes flickered with something admiration, perhaps, or something deeper. Miss Marple's needles paused, just for a moment. Admiration could curdle into obsession, she knew, like milk left too long in the sun. "And did anyone show particular interest in the goblet?" Miss Marple asked, her voice mild as she resumed her knitting. "Customers, perhaps, or others." Clara hesitated, her fingers tightening on the handkerchief. Mrs. Elton was always asking about it, but she never bought much, just small things like a cameo or a teacup. She'd linger, though, talking to Mr. Wren about his finds. "And Mr. Hargreaves?" Her voice hardened. "He was in the shop 3 days ago, arguing. Said the goblet was a fake, that Mr. Wren was fooling everyone. They shouted so loud, I thought they'd come to blows. Mr. Wren told him to get out, and he did, but he looked furious. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her face remained serene. She pictured Hargreaves, his ruddy face and booming voice, a man whose pride was as brittle as old porcelain. And Mr. Hargreaves came. Often, she prompted. Not often, but lately. Yes, Clara said. He'd stand outside sometimes, just watching the shop. I saw him once last week, across the street, staring at the window where the goblet was. It gave me the shivers. She shivered now, pulling her shawl tighter. Miss Marple noted the gesture, her mind drifting to a village woman who'd watched her neighbor's house with similar intensity. Driven by a grudge over a borrowed shawl. And what of young Thomas? Miss Marple asked, her tone as casual as if she were inquiring about the weather. Mr. Wren's son, I mean, did he visit the shop? Clara's lips tightened. Not much. They'd had a falling out, you see. Thomas came by a week ago, asking for money. I heard them in the back, Mr. Wren saying he wouldn't give him a penny until he straightened up. Thomas stormed out, slamming the door. He's wild, that one. Always at the pub, they say, or worse. Her voice held a hint of disapproval, and Miss Marple wondered if it stemmed from loyalty to Wren or something more personal. The tea had cooled, and Mrs. Clement bustled out to refresh the pot, her cheerful chatter a brief interruption. Miss Marple used the moment to study Clara. Her hands, rough from years of handling antiques, bore no cuts or bruises, no sign of a struggle. Her eyes, though held a flicker of furor, was it guilt? Miss Marple recalled a young seamstress who'd trembled just so, hiding a theft behind tears. You locked the shop at 6, you said, Miss Marple resumed, offering a fresh cup, and Mr. Wren stayed behind. Yes, Clara said, her voice steadier now. He often did. Said he liked the quiet to work on his papers. I offered to stay once, but he waved me off. Said he'd lock up himself. She paused, her brow furrowing. I keep thinking if I'd stayed, maybe he'd still be alive. Miss Marple patted her hand, her touch light but warm. You mustn't blame yourself, my dear. These things happen, and we can only do our best to understand them. Her words were kind, but her mind was sharp, sifting through Clara's story. The locked door, the undisturbed windows, the key in Wren's pocket-hole suggested an intimate knowledge of the shop. Clara had a key, but so, perhaps, did others? Or had Wren let his killer in? As Clara rose to leave, thanking Mrs. Clement for the tea, Miss Marple's eyes lingered on her retreating figure. The girl's steps were quick, almost hurried, as if eager to escape scrutiny. Miss Marple's needles clicked faster, her thoughts weaving a pattern. Clara's devotion seemed genuine, but devotion could be a mask, as she'd seen in a vicar's daughter who'd smiled while betraying a friend. Yet Clara's fear felt real. To fear of what? The killer? Or discovery? Back in her parlor that evening, Miss Marple spread her knitting across her lap, the fire casting a warm glow on the walls. Cherry, bringing a fresh pot of tea, chattered about the village's latest theories. They're saying Clara was in love with Mr. Wren, she said, her eyes wide. Mrs. Price swears she saw her crying over him once, when he scolded her for dropping a vase. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her mind turning to Clara's flushed cheeks, her nervous hands. Love, envy, fear, these were threads in the same tapestry, and she would need to unravel them carefully. She thought of Hargreaves too, his anger over the goblet's authenticity. A fake, he'd called it, but why such venom? And Thomas, with his debts and his temper, had he lingered near the shop that night, nursing his grudge? Mrs. Elton's frequent visits puzzled her too. Her chatter about vases seemed a flimsy excuse for lingering. Miss Marple's needles paused as she recalled a village spinster who'd hoarded trinkets to fill a lonely life. Could Mrs. Elton's admiration for Wren's stock hide a deeper hunger? The fire crackled, and Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind as sharp as the dagger that had ended Percival Wren's life. Clara's tale was a beginning, but only that. The shop, with its locked door and missing goblet, held secrets yet to be uncovered. And Miss Marple, with her quiet ways and her knack for seeing through masks, was determined to find them. Chapter 4. The Rival's Grudge. The narrow road to Lower Mead wound through fields, dusted with the first frost of the season, and Miss Jane Marple, bundled in her tweed coat and sensible hat, sat primly in the vicar's ancient Morris as it rattled along. Mr. Clement had offered to drive her to Mr. Hargreaves's antique shop, his curiosity about the murder barely concealed behind his clerical demeanor. "Dreadful business, Miss Marple," he said, navigating a sharp turn. Hargreaves and Wren were like oil and water, always at odds. But to think he'd stoop to murder? His voice trailed off, and Miss Marple's lips twitched faintly, her knitting bag resting on her knees. She said nothing, but her mind was already threading through the village gossip she'd heard at the post office. Hargreaves's envy, his blustering rants, his obsession with besting Percival Wren, the shop, a squat building with a faded sign, reading Hargreaves' Antiquities, stood at the edge of Lower Mead, its windows less inviting than Wren's, but crammed with their own array of relics. A bell jangled as Miss Marple entered, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The air smelled of wax polish and old leather, and shelves groaned with brass lamps, chipped Delft plates, and dusty clocks. Mr. Hargreaves himself stood behind a counter, polishing a silver tankard with a vigor that suggested irritation rather than care. He was a portly man, his face ruddy beneath a shock of graying hair, his eyes narrowing as he recognized his visitor. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice a forced boom of civility. "To what do I owe the pleasure? Come to browse, or is this about poor Wren?" Miss Marple smiled, her manner as gentle as a summer breeze. "A little of both, perhaps," she said, settling onto a creaky chair. He gestured to, "I was passing through, and thought I might see your collection. And, of course, I couldn't help hearing about the tragedy in St. Mary Mead." Her tone was light, but her eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, noted the quick tightening of Hargreaves's jaw. He set the tankard down with a thud. "Tragedy? Yes. Shocking. Wren was a fool, mind you, but no one deserves that." He leaned forward, his hand splayed on the counter. "Police have been sniffing around, asking about my row with him. All nonsense. I didn't like the man, but I'm no killer." Miss Marple's needles emerged from her bag, clicking softly as she began a new row. "Of course not," she said, her voice soothing. "But you did argue, I understand, about that Elizabethan goblet." She tilted her head, as if the question were mere curiosity. But her mind recalled Clara's account of Hargreaves's fury, his accusation that the goblet was a fraud. Hargreaves's face flushed a deeper red. We argued, that goblet was his pride and joy, but I told him it was a fake. Overpriced, overhyped nonsense. He'd been fleecing collectors for years, and I wasn't going to let him ruin my reputation with that sham. His voice rose, and he gestured wildly, nearly knocking over a brass candlestick. "I'd have bought it myself, just to prove it was worthless, but Wren wouldn't sell. Said it was spoken for a London buyer," he claimed. "All lies to drive up its value." Miss Marple's needles paused, just for a moment. "A London buyer," she echoed, her tone mild. "How interesting. And you were certain it was a fake?" She thought of a village jeweler who'd once sworn a rival's diamond was glass, only to be proven wrong at great cost. Pride, she knew, could blind a man as surely as greed. Hargreaves snorted, crossing his arms. "Certain. I've been in this trade 30 years. I know a forgery when I see one." Wren was all flash, no substance, parading that goblet like it was the Holy Grail, when it was likely cobbled together in some back-alley workshop. He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "I saw it up close, you know. Last week, when I went to his shop, the chase scene was too perfect, the patina too even. No 16th century craftsman worked like that." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to the counter, where a heavy walking stick rested, its ebony handle polished to a gleam. She noted its weight, the worn grip, suggesting frequent use. "You visited his shop often, then?" she asked, her tone as casual as if she were inquiring about the weather. "Not often," Hargreaves said, his eyes narrowing, enough to keep an eye on him. "He was always undercutting me, stealing clients. That goblet was the last straw. I told him what I thought, and he threw me out. Said I was jealous." He laughed, a harsh sound. "Jealous of that charlatan. I'd have outbid him in a heartbeat if he'd played fair." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her mind turning over his words. Hargreaves's anger was palpable, but was it enough to drive him to murder? She recalled a St. Mary Mead farmer who'd smashed a rival's cart in a fit of rage, his temper a spark that needed little kindling. "And you left his shop after this argument?" she asked, her voice gentle but probing. "I, before dusk," Hargreaves said quickly. "Went home, had my supper. Police can ask my housekeeper if they don't believe me." His tone was defiant, but Miss Marple noted a slight tremor in his hands as he picked up the tankard again. She glanced at his knuckles, expecting perhaps a bruise from a struggle, but saw only a small, fresh cut on his right hand, barely healed. "From a broken vase," he said, catching her gaze. "Clumsy customer dropped it yesterday." Miss Marple smiled, her expression serene. "How unfortunate," she said, but her mind was elsewhere. A cut from a vase, or from gripping a dagger's hilt too tightly. She thought of a village boy who'd nicked himself stealing apples, his lie as transparent as glass. "You must be very busy here," she continued, her eyes sweeping the shop. It was well stocked, but lacked the rare treasures of Wren's collection. A brass clock ticked loudly, its face slightly cracked, and a set of chipped teacups sat forlornly on a shelf. Hargreaves's pride was evident, but so was his struggle to compete. "Busy enough," he said, his tone gruff. "Not all of us need to flaunt our wares like Wren. I deal in honest goods, not fairy tales." He gestured to a shelf of silver spoons, their handles worn but genuine. "These are my trade, Miss Marple. Solid, reliable. Not like that goblet, all flash and no substance." Miss Marple rose, tucking her knitting into her bag. "You have a fine collection," she said, her voice warm. "I'm sure you take great pride in it." She paused at the door, her hand on the knob. "One last thing, Mr. Hargreaves. Did you ever see anyone else near Wren's shop? Someone who might have shared your concerns about him?" Hargreaves hesitated, his eyes flicking to the window. "Can't say I did," he said at last, "though. That son of his, Thomas, was always skulking about. Never trusted him. And Mrs. Elton, she was in and out of Wren's shop like a moth to a flame, always asking questions, never buying much." He shook his head. "Wren had a knack for drawing people in, I'll give him that." Miss Marple thanked him and stepped into the chilly air, the bell jangling behind her. As Mr. Clement started the car, she sat quietly, her mind weaving through Hargreaves's words. His anger was real, his envy sharper than the dagger that killed Wren, the cut on his hand, the walking stick. His presence near the shop all were threads in a pattern she was beginning to see. She thought of a St. Mary Mead shopkeeper who'd sabotaged a rival's wares, his grudge a slow poison. Hargreaves's bluster felt like a shield, but for what? Greed for the goblet, or something deeper? Back in St. Mary Mead, as the sun dipped. Below the hills, Miss Marple sat by her parlor fire, her knitting spread across her lap. Cherry bustled in with a tray, chattering about the latest gossip. "They're saying Hargreaves was in debt," she said, setting down a teapot. "Mrs. Price heard he owed money to some London dealer. Maybe that's why he wanted that goblet so bad." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed in the firelight. Debt, envy, a cut hand, small things, but to her, they were like stitches in a tapestry, each one revealing a little more of the truth. Chapter 5. The Customer's Obsession. The cottage of Mrs. Lavinia Elton stood at the edge of St. Mary Mead, its walls smothered in climbing roses that, even in late autumn, clung stubbornly to their last blooms. Miss Jane Marple, her black handbag swinging gently, knocked on the polished door. Her invitation to tea having been accepted with a flustered enthusiasm that piqued her curiosity, Mrs. Elton, a widow of uncertain years, opened the door herself. Her round face flushed beneath a gaudy hat adorned with silk flowers. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to come," she exclaimed, ushering her into a parlor that seemed to burst with trinkets. China figurines crowded every surface, their painted smiles glinting in the light, while gilt-framed mirrors and embroidered cushions competed for space. The air was thick with lavender and the faint musk of old velvet. "Such a charming home," Miss Marple said, settling into a plush armchair, her knitting bag at her side. Her eyes, sharp behind their spectacles, took in the clutter. A chipped vase here, a tarnished locket there. None of the caliber of Wren's treasures. "You must be quite the collector yourself." Mrs. Elton beamed, her hands fluttering as she poured tea from a florid teapot. "Oh, I dabble, Miss Marple, I dabble. Nothing like poor Mr. Wren's stock, of course. He had such an eye." Her voice trembled slightly, and she busied herself with a plate of macaroons, offering one with a nervous smile. "It's dreadful." "What happened?" "Simply dreadful. To think I was in his shop just that afternoon." Miss Marple accepted a macaroon, her manner as serene as the village green on a Sunday. "Indeed, I heard you were there," she said, her tone light but probing. "You were interested in a vase, I believe." She recalled Clara's mention of Mrs. Elton's frequent visits, her chatter about minor items while her eyes lingered on Wren's rarer pieces. A village spinster, Miss Marple remembered, had once hoarded buttons with the same fervor, her obsession masking a deeper loneliness. Mrs. Elton's cheeks pinked, and she fussed with her teacup. "Yes, a lovely little Meissen piece, I thought. It would look splendid on my mantel. But Mr. Wren was so busy, you see, with his ledgers. I didn't stay long, left around 5, I think." Her eyes darted to a corner of the room, where a small table held a collection of glass paperweights, their colors swirling like trapped dreams. Miss Marple noted the glance, her mind turning to a neighbor who'd fidgeted just so when questioned about a missing brooch. "And the goblet?" Miss Marple asked, her needles emerging to click softly in her lap. "That Elizabethan piece Mr. Wren was so proud of, did you ever admire it?" Her tone was casual, but her eyes missed nothing. The slight stiffening of Mrs. Elton's shoulders, the quick sip of tea to cover a pause. "Oh, it was beautiful," Mrs. Elton said, her voice a shade too bright. "All that silver, so intricate, but far too grand for me. I prefer simpler things." She gestured to a shelf of porcelain shepherdesses, their delicate staffs chipped from careless handling. Mr. Wren would talk about it. Those said it was from a noble house, worth a fortune. I just nodded. You know, his passion was quite contagious. Her laugh was high, almost brittle, and Miss Marple's needles paused. Just for a moment, she thought of a St. Mary Mead widow who'd collected teacups, her parlor a shrine to a life unlifted. Admiration could twist into something sharper. Miss Marple knew covetousness, perhaps, or a need to possess what another cherished. "You must have enjoyed your visits to his shop," she said, offering a gentle smile. "He had such a way with his customers, I hear." Mrs. Elton's eyes softened, a flicker of something wistfulness, perhaps crossing her face. "He did. He'd explain every piece, its history, its maker, made you feel it was alive, somehow. I'd go in for a trinket, but I'd stay for his stories." She sighed, then caught herself, straightening. "But I wasn't there for the goblet, if that's what you're thinking. I couldn't afford it, and besides, I'm no thief." Miss Marple's smile remained, though her mind was busy. "Of course not, my dear," she said, her voice soothing. "But you must have seen others in the shop. Mr. Hargreaves, perhaps, or young Thomas? She watched closely as Mrs. Elton's fingers tightened on her cup, the porcelain clinking faintly. Mr. Hargreaves was there that morning, Mrs. Elton said, her tone cautious. Arguing, as usual. He was so cross about that goblet, calling it a fraud. Mr. Wren just laughed him off, but it was tense. And Thomas, I saw him once, a week or so ago, lurking outside. He didn't come in, just stood by the window, looking sullen. She hesitated, then added, Clara was always there, of course, fussing over Mr. Wren, polishing things. She was devoted, but her voice trailed off, and she busied herself with the teapot. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her thoughts weaving through Mrs. Elton's words. That hesitation, that but, it was a thread worth pulling. But, she prompted, her voice as gentle as a breeze. Mrs. Elton flushed, her eyes darting to the window. Oh, nothing, really. Just, Clara seemed so anxious lately. Always. Watching Mr. Wren, like she was afraid he'd vanish. I thought it odd, that's all. She laughed again, a nervous trill. Silly of me, I suppose. Miss Marple nodded, her mind drifting to a village girl who'd watched her employer with the same intensity, her devotion a mask for resentment. She glanced around the parlor again, noting a small silver spoon on a side table, its handle engraved with a pattern she'd seen in Wren's shop. What a charming spoon, she said, pointing. One of Mr. Wren's, I presume. Mrs. Elton's hand froze mid-gesture, then recovered. Oh yes, bought it last month. A little indulgence. Her smile was tight, and Miss Marple noted the spoon's pristine condition, unlike the chipped and faded items around it. A recent purchase, or something more. As the tea grew cold, Miss Marple rose, thanking Mrs. Elton for her hospitality. You've been most helpful, she said, her tone warm but her eyes sharp. It's such a puzzle, isn't it? Who could have wanted that goblet so badly? She paused at the door, her handbag clasped tightly. Did you ever notice anyone else near the shop, perhaps in the evening? Mrs. Elton hesitated, her fingers twisting a lace doily. Not really, she said at last, though I did see Mr. Hargreaves's car once, parked down the lane, a few nights before. Odd place to park, I thought, but I didn't think much of it. Her voice was airy, but her eyes avoided Miss Marple's, stepping into the crisp air. Miss Marple walked slowly back to the village, her mind as busy as her needles had been. Mrs. Elton's parlor, with its clutter of second-rate trinkets, spoke of a woman who craved beauty but lacked the means or perhaps the discernment to acquire it. Her admiration for Wren, her frequent visits, her nervous chatter all suggested a fixation, but on what? The goblet, or the man himself? And that spoon, so out of place among her other purchases, nagged at Miss Marple's thoughts. She recalled a St. Mary Mead matron who'd borrowed a neighbor's locket, claiming it was a gift. Small thefts could lead to larger ones. Back in her parlor, as the fire cast shadows on the walls, Miss Marple spread her knitting and sipped a fresh cup of tea. Cherry, bustling in with a tray, chattered about the village's latest whispers. There, saying Mrs. Elton was sweet on Mr. Wren, she said, her eyes wide. Mrs. Price saw her blushing when he showed her a necklace once, and she spent a fortune in that shop, though she never bought the big things. Miss Marple's lips twitched faintly. A fortune spent, a spoon acquired, a car parked oddly each, was a stitch in the pattern, and she was beginning to see its shape. Chapter 6. The Sun's Burden. The Red Lion Pub, tucked at the corner of St. Mary Mead's High Street, hummed with the low murmur of evening patrons, its windows glowing like beacons in the gathering dusk. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, stepped inside with a quiet determination, her black handbag clutched firmly. The air was thick with the scent of ale and pipe smoke, and the polished bar reflected the flicker of gas lamps. She had arranged to meet Thomas Wren here, the estranged son of the murdered Percival Wren, whose sullen presence had been the subject of much village talk. Miss Marple, with her knack for seeing through the masks people wore, was eager to take. His measured. Thomas sat in a corner booth, his lanky frame slouched over a pint, his dark hair falling untidily across his forehead. His eyes, shadowed and restless, flicked up as Miss Marple approached, a mix of wariness and defiance in his gaze. "Miss Marple," he muttered, rising only slightly, his manners rough but not entirely absent. "Didn't expect you here. Police send you?" His voice held a bitter edge, and Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in his hand as he gripped his glass. "Not at all, my dear," she said, settling opposite him, her knitting bag resting on the table like a silent companion. "I merely thought we might chat. This must be a trying time for you." Her tone was gentle, almost maternal, but her eyes were sharp, catching the way Thomas's jaw tightened at her words. She recalled a young man in St. Mary Mead, years ago, whose resentment toward his father had led to a stolen watch and a broken trust. Families, she knew, could harbor the deepest wounds. Thomas took a long sip, his gaze fixed on the table's scarred surface, trying. "That's one way to put it. Father's dead, and half the village thinks I did it. All because we didn't see eye to eye." He laughed, a harsh sound that drew a glance from a nearby farmer. "He was a stubborn old fool, but I didn't kill him." Miss Marple's needles emerged, their soft click a steady counterpoint to the pub's hum. "Of course," she said, her voice soothing. "But you did visit him recently, I hear. At the shop." She tilted her head, her expression one of mild curiosity, but her mind was alert. Sifting through the gossip Cherry had relayed, Thomas begging for money, his father's sharp refusal, the slammed door that echoed down High Street. Thomas's eyes narrowed, but he nodded. "A week ago. Needed some cash debts, you know? Nothing serious, just a rough patch." He shrugged, but his fingers tightened on the glass. "He wouldn't give me a shilling. Called me a disgrace. Said I'd squandered everything he'd built. We argued, sure, but I left. Didn't see him again." His voice was flat, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of pain beneath it. Like a bruised underskin, she thought of a St. Mary Mead lad who'd gambled away his inheritance, his defiance a shield for shame. "And the night he died?" she asked, her tone as light as if she were inquiring about his supper. "You were here, I believe." Thomas hesitated, his eyes darting to the bar, where the barman was wiping glasses with a cloth. "I, here till late. Ask Jim, he'll tell you." He gestured vaguely toward the barman, but his voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple noted it, her mind turning to a village boy who'd lied about his whereabouts, his alibi crumbling under a neighbor's casual remark. "And what time did you leave?" she pressed, her needles moving steadily. "It's such a small village. People notice comings and goings." Thomas shifted in his seat, his fingers drumming on the table. "Dunno exactly. 10 maybe. Had a few pints, lost track. Went home after." His gaze slid away, and Miss Marple's lips pursed faintly. The barman, she recalled from Inspector Craddock's notes, had been vague about Thomas's departure, mentioning only that he'd been in and out that evening. A shaky alibi, she thought, like a poorly knit scarf, full of holes. She leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but probing. "You must have passed by your father's shop on your way home. Did you see anything unusual? A light, perhaps, or someone about?" Thomas's hand stilled, and for a moment his eyes met hers, sharp and guarded. "Didn't go that way," he said quickly. "Took the lane behind the church. Shorter." He drained his pint, setting the glass down with a clink. Miss Marple nodded, but her mind was busy. The lane behind the church was indeed shorter, but it passed within sight of Wren's shop, its back window visible from the path. Had Thomas seen something? "And the goblet?" she asked, her tone unchanged. "That Elizabethan piece your father valued so highly, did you ever take an interest in it?" She watched his face closely, noting the way his mouth tightened, a shadow crossing his features. Didn't care for it, he said, his voice curt. Just another of his obsessions. Always going on about its history, its worth. Said it'd make his name, set him above that Hargreaves. I told him to sell it, pay off some debts, but he wouldn't hear of it. His fingers clenched, and Miss Marple saw the knuckles whiten, a sign of anger or guilt. She recalled a young man who'd stolen from his father to settle a gambling debt. His resentment a spark that had flared into theft. You must have felt very hurt, she said, her voice warm with sympathy. Fathers and sons, they do clash sometimes. I knew a boy once, in St. Mary Mead, who quarreled with his father over money. It ended badly, I'm afraid. Her eyes held his, gentle but unwavering, and Thomas flushed, looking away. Hurt, maybe, he muttered. But I didn't kill him. I wasn't even near the shop that night. His voice rose slightly, drawing another glance from the farmer. And Miss Marple noted the defensive edge, like a cornered animal bearing. Its teeth. She folded her knitting, tucking it into her bag. Of course, my dear, she said, rising. You've been most helpful. It's such a puzzle, isn't it? But puzzles do have a way of sorting themselves out. She smiled, but her mind was weaving through Thomas's words, picking at the loose threads. His anger was raw, his alibi uncertain, and his avoidance of the shop's vicinity felt too convenient. She thought of a St. Mary Mead youth who'd lied to cover a petty crime, his bravado a thin veil over fear, as she stepped into the cool evening air, the pub's warmth fading behind her. Miss Marple paused on the high street, her eyes drifting to the darkened windows of Wren's shop. A constable stood guard, his silhouette stark against the lamplight. Thomas's story, she mused, was like a half-finished tapestry, its pattern unclear. Had he lingered near the shop, driven by resentment or desperation? Or was his anger merely a distraction, like the goblet's theft itself? Back in her parlor, as the fire crackled and Cherry set out a late supper, Miss Marple spread her knitting and sipped her tea. They're saying Thomas owes money to some rough types in Lower Mead, Cherry said, her voice hushed with excitement. Mrs. Price heard he was at the pub till closing, but no one saw him leave. Miss Marple's lips twitched faintly. Debts, a quarrel, a vague alibi etch, was a stitch in the pattern, and she was beginning to see its outline. Thomas's burden was heavy, but whether it was guilt or grief, she could not yet say. Chapter 7. The Goblet's Secret. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across St. Mary Mead, gilding the cobblestones of High Street as Miss Jane Marple made her way back to Percival Wren's antique shop. Inspector Craddock had telephoned that morning, his voice tinged with the weary excitement of a new discovery, and invited her to examine a find in Wren's desk. Miss Marple, her black handbag swinging gently, stepped through the shop's door, the brass bell jangling faintly in the stillness. The air inside was heavy with the scent of old wood and wax, now laced with the faint, lingering bitterness of tragedy. The shelves, crowded with relics, seemed to watch her silently, their treasures untouched save for the empty stand where the Elizabethan goblet had once gleamed. Craddock stood by the oak desk where Wren's body had been found, his notebook open and a constable at his side. The dagger was gone, taken for evidence, but the desk bore the scars of that night, a dried ink stain, a scattering of papers, and the broken quill Miss Marple had noted before. Miss Marple, Craddock greeted, his face brightening. You'll want to see this? Found it in a hidden drawer, locked tight. Took us a bit to pry it open. He held up a slim folder of yellowed papers, tied with a faded ribbon, and a small leather notebook. Its edges worn but intact. Miss Marple settled onto a stool, her knitting bag at her feet, and adjusted her spectacles. How very intriguing, she said, her voice soft but alert. Papers, you say? About the goblet, perhaps? Her eyes, sharp as ever, noted the careful way Craddock handled the folder. as if it held secrets as delicate as spun glass. Exactly, Craddock said, untying the ribbon. Provenance documents for the goblet. Wren's notes claim it came from a Norfolk estate, once owned by a baron who served Elizabeth I. If genuine, it's worth a small fortune, tens of thousands, maybe more. He spread the papers on the desk, revealing sketches of the goblet. It's silver chased with intricate vines, alongside letters from a London appraiser. But here's the thing, Craddock continued, his brow furrowing. There's a note from Wren himself, dated a week ago, saying he'd found a buyer, someone anonymous, through a dealer in London. And look at this. He opened the notebook, pointing to a scrawled entry. Hargreaves claims it's a fake. Must verify. Buyer insists on discretion. Miss Marple's lips pursed faintly, her mind turning to a St. Mary Mead auction, where a supposedly rare vase had sparked a bitter dispute over authenticity. A secret buyer, she murmured, her fingers hovering over the notebook, and Mr. Hargreaves's accusations, how curious. She recalled his florid face, his insistence that the goblet was a fraud, and wondered if his anger stemmed from knowledge or envy. Did Mr. Wren mention this buyer to anyone else? She asked, her tone as mild as a summer breeze. Craddock shook his head. Not that we've found. Clara says he was tight-lipped about it, even with her. Kept these papers locked away, separate from his usual ledgers. He gestured to the desk's hidden drawer, its lock scratched but intact. Whoever killed him didn't touch this. Focused on the goblet and nothing else. Miss Marple leaned closer, her eyes scanning the papers. The appraiser's letter was meticulous, describing the goblet's hallmarks and craftsmanship, but a marginal note in Wren's hand caught her attention. Check silver purity. Possible modern alloy. Her needles, still in her bag, seemed to itch for movement as she processed this. Had Wren himself doubted the goblet's authenticity, or was he merely thorough? She thought of a village jeweler who'd questioned a gem's origin, only to be proven right by a hidden flaw. A fake would change everything, she said softly, almost to herself. It might explain the theft or the murder. Craddock raised an eyebrow. You think the killer knew it was a fake? Took it to cover something up? Perhaps, Miss Marple said, her voice thoughtful, or they believed it was real and worth killing for. Either way, the goblet's absence is no accident. Her gaze drifted to the empty stand, its velvet lining pristine, the dust around it undisturbed. She recalled the scuff mark by the storeroom door, the snapped quill, the wax smudge she'd noticed later, small things. But to her, they were like misplaced stitches in a pattern, each one telling a story. Have you traced this London dealer? She asked, tapping the appraiser's letter. We're trying, Craddock said, rubbing his neck. The dealer's reputable, but cagey. Says the buyer wanted anonymity, paid through a third party. We're digging into Hargreaves's finances. 2 rumors, he's in debt. Might have wanted the goblet to sell it himself, fake or not. Miss Marple nodded, her mind weaving through the threads. Hargreaves's grudge, Clara's devotion, Mrs. Elton's obsession. Thomas's resentment all circled the goblet, but its secret lay in these papers. If it was a fake, the theft might be a ruse to hide a deeper motive, like a village scandal she'd once unraveled where a stolen painting masked a family's shame. If genuine, its value was motive enough for murder. And the dagger, she asked, her eyes flicking to the desk. Any trace of who handled it? Craddock sighed. No prints, just like the stand. The case it was in was locked, key in Wren's pocket. Whoever used it knew where to find it and how to get it without a fuss. He paused, then added, We're checking alibis again. Thomas's Ishaki barman says he left the pub earlier than he claimed, maybe around 9. Mrs. Elton's car was seen near the shop that evening, too, though she denies it. Miss Marple's lips twitched faintly, her mind recalling Mrs. Elton's nervous chatter, Thomas's evasive eyes. People do forget their movements, she said, or choose not to remember. She rose, her shawl slipping slightly as she moved to the stand once more. The shop's silence seemed to press against her, its relics watching like silent witnesses. She thought of the wax smudge she'd noticed near the dagger's case, a detail Craddock had overlooked. It was faint, but distinct, like the residue of a polished stick. Hargreaves's walking stick, she recalled, gleamed with wax, its handle worn smooth. A small thing, but to Miss Marple, it was a thread worth pulling. "Inspector," she said, turning to him, "might you have your men look for traces of wax elsewhere in the shop? On the floor, perhaps, or near the door?" Her tone was polite, almost diffident, but Craddock knew better than to dismiss her. "Wax," he echoed, then nodded. "I'll have them check. Anything specific you're thinking?" "Oh, nothing specific," Miss Marple said, her smile serene. "Just a thought. Small things, you know, can be so revealing." She thought of A.S.T. Mary Mead thief, who'd left a trail of candle wax, betraying his midnight raid. As Craddock jotted a note, she stepped to the storeroom door, her eyes scanning the scuff mark again. It was slight, but deliberate, as if someone had paused there, perhaps to listen, or to plan. Back in her parlor that evening, as the fire cast a warm glow across her knitting, Miss Marple sipped her tea and turned over the goblet's secret. Cherry, bustling in with a tray, chattered about the village's latest whispers. "They're saying Mr. Wren was in talks with some bigwig in London," she said, setting down a plate of biscuits. "Mrs. Price heard he was planning to sell that goblet for a fortune, but he was worried it might not be real." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her thoughts weaving a pattern. A secret buyer, a questioned goblet, a waxed stick, each was a stitch, and the tapestry was growing clearer. The goblet's theft was no mere robbery, she was certain, but a key to a darker truth. Chapter 8. A pattern emerges. The soft glow of Miss Jane Marple's parlor fire cast flickering shadows across the walls, lending a cozy warmth to the room as the autumn evening deepened outside. Her knitting lay spread across her lap, a delicate web of cream-colored wool, but her needles were still, her hands resting lightly on the yarn. A cup of tea steamed on the table beside her, its fragrance mingling with the faint scent of lavender from a bowl of potpourri. Miss Marple's eyes, bright and thoughtful behind her spectacles, stared into the flames, her mind weaving through the threads of Percival Wren's murder as deftly as her fingers worked her stitches. The village of St. Mary Mead was abuzz with theories, but to Miss Marple, the truth lay in the small details, the quiet inconsistencies that others overlooked. She leaned back in her armchair, her thoughts turning to the suspects, each a distinct figure in the tapestry of the crime. Clara Phelps, with her mousy demeanor and unwavering devotion, had access to the shop and a key to its secrets. Yet her trembling hands and tearful eyes suggested fear rather than cunning. Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead maid who'd wept over a broken vase, her sorrow masking a theft, but Clara's distress felt deeper, rooted perhaps in loyalty or loss. Could she have acted out of a hidden resentment, or was she merely a witness to something she dared not reveal? Mr. Hargreaves, by contrast, was all bluster and bile, his envy of Wren's success as sharp as the dagger that killed him. His insistence that the goblet was a fake, coupled with his financial troubles, painted a vivid motive. The cut on his hand, the waxed walking stick, his presence near the shop after dusk were stitches in a pattern that pointed to him. Miss Marple thought of a village grocer who'd sabotaged a rival's scales, his anger a slow-burning fuse. Hargreaves's temper was volatile, but was it enough to drive him to murder, or was his outrage a performance to hide a colder calculation? Mrs. Lavinia Elton, with her cluttered parlor and nervous chatter, was a puzzle. Her frequent visits to Wren's shop, her fixation on his stories, and the pristine silver spoon among her trinkets suggested a woman driven by more than casual interest. Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead widow who'd hoarded letters from a lost love. Her obsession, a quiet madness. Mrs. Elton's admiration for Wren could have twisted into desperation. but her flustered denials and shaky alibi her car seen near the shop hinted at fear, not guilt. Had she stumbled upon something that night, or was she concealing a theft of her own? Thomas Wren, the wayward son, carried a burden of resentment as heavy as his gambling debts. His shaky alibi at the Red Lion, his quarrel with his father, and his evasive answers were threads of suspicion, yet his raw anger felt more like grief than malice. Miss Marple thought of a young man in St. Mary Mead who'd stolen from his father to spite him, only to weep at his grave. Thomas's debts gave him motive, but his sullen demeanor suggested a soul more lost than vengeful. Had he lingered near the shop, driven by desperation, or was he merely a scapegoat for another's crime? The goblet itself, that missing Elizabethan treasure, was the knot at the center of the tapestry. Its theft, so deliberate amid the shop's untouched relics, was no afterthought. The provenance papers, hidden in Wren's desk, hinted at a secret buyer and a question of authenticity, a detail that shifted the pattern. If the goblet was a fake, as Hargreaves claimed, its theft might be a cover for murder, a way to deflect suspicion from a personal grudge. If genuine, its value was motive enough for any of the suspects. Miss Marple's mind lingered on the wax smudge near the dagger's case, the scuff mark by the storeroom, the snapped quillage a clue to the killer's movements, their careful planning betrayed by these small oversights. She sipped her tea, her thoughts drifting to a village scandal years ago, where a stolen necklace had masked a deeper betrayal. The goblet's absence was like that necklace, a distraction from the true motive. Wren's death felt personal, the dagger a weapon of opportunity, not chance. Someone had known the shop's layout, the dagger's place, the goblet's value or lack thereof. Miss Marple's lips pursed faintly as she considered Hargreaves's cut hand, a detail that nagged like a dropped stitch. A vase, he'd said, but the timing was too neat, the wound too fresh. She recalled a St. Mary Mead thief who'd nicked himself on a window latch, his lie unraveling under gentle questioning. Cherry, her maid, bustled in with a fresh pot of tea, her chatter breaking the silence. "Village is all aflutter, Miss Marple," she said, setting down the tray. "Mrs. Price says Mr. Hargreaves was seen arguing with a man in a posh coat outside his shop yesterday, some London type, maybe a dealer. And Thomas Wren's been drinking more than usual, they say, like he's got something to hide." Cherry's eyes gleamed with gossip, but Miss Marple's smile was serene, her mind filing away the tidbits. "A London dealer, you say?" she murmured, her needles stirring at last. How interesting. The mention of a stranger aligned with Wren's secret buyer, a thread she'd urged Craddock to pursue. As for Thomas, his drinking was no surprise, but it suggested strain, not necessarily guilt. She thought of a St. Mary Mead youth whose binges followed a family quarrel, his heart heavier than his purse. The pattern was clearer now, but gaps remained, like a scarf missing its final rose. Miss Marple rose, moving to the window to gaze at the darkened village. The shop, she knew, held the key, not just the goblet, but the moment it was taken, the killer had entered with purpose, left with care, yet left traces of haste. The wax, the scuff, the quill. Hargreaves's presence loomed largest, but Clara's fear, Mrs. Elton's nerves, and Thomas's evasions could not be dismissed. She recalled a village mystery where a rival's grudge had masked a deeper truth, the solution lying in a single overlooked detail. Here, the wax smudge felt like that detail, a silent witness to the killer's identity. As she returned to her knitting, the fire's glow warming her hands, Miss Marple's resolve was firm. She would speak to Craddock tomorrow, urging him to trace the London dealer and recheck Hargreaves's movements. The tapestry was nearly complete, its threads of greed, envy, and betrayal weaving toward a truth she could almost touch. For now, she knitted on, each stitch a step closer to unraveling the mystery of the stabbed collector. Chapter 9. The rival slipped. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of St. Mary Mead, softening the outlines of the village as Miss Jane Marple made her way to the police station, her sensible shoes tapping lightly on the path. Her black handbag swung at her side, and her mind was as sharp as the autumn air, weaving through the threads of Percival Wren's murder. Inspector Craddock had telephoned at breakfast, his voice taut with new information, and invited her to join him for an update on Mr. Hargreaves, the rival collector whose envy seemed to burn brighter with each revelation. Miss Marple, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, felt the pattern of the crime growing clearer, like a tapestry nearing its final stitches. The police station, a squat brick building beside the village hall, smelled of ink and polished wood. Craddock greeted her in his office, his desk cluttered with reports and a steaming mug of tea. "Miss Marple," he said, rising, "you've a knack for timing. We've got something on Hargreaves might be the break we need." He gestured to a chair, his lean face alight with cautious excitement. "His finances are a mess. Owes thousands to a London creditor, some dealer tied to Wren's buyer, and a witness old Mrs. Gibbs, who runs the tobacconist, saw him near Wren's shop after dark, the night of the murder. Not at home, as he claimed." Miss Marple settled into the chair, her expression serene but her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. "Dear me," she murmured, "how very careless of him." She thought of a St. Mary Mead shopkeeper who'd lied about his whereabouts, his alibi undone by a neighbor's sharp eyes. "And what time did Mrs. Gibbs see him?" she asked, her voice as gentle as a breeze. "Around 9:30, Craddock said, flipping open his notebook. "She was closing up, saw Hargreaves crossing the street toward Wren's shop, said he looked furtive, kept to the shadows. He told us he was home by 7, supping with his housekeeper, but she's vague on the hour, says he was in and out all evening." He leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "If he was there at 9, he's lied about his alibi. And with his debts, that goblet could have been his way out." Miss Marple's lips pursed faintly, her mind turning to the wax smudge she'd noticed near the dagger's case, the cut on Hargreaves's hand, the polished stick he carried. "A man in debt is often a desperate man," she said, her tone thoughtful. "But to kill for a goblet he believed was a fake. How curious." She recalled Hargreaves's bluster, his insistence that Wren's prize was a fraud, and wondered if his certainty masked a deeper intent. Had he stolen it to expose Wren, or to sell it, regardless of its worth? "I'd like to speak to him again," she said, her voice mild but firm. "If you think it appropriate, Inspector." Craddock nodded, accustomed to her quiet persistence, and arranged for Hargreaves to be brought to his shop in Lower Mead. As they drove through the misty fields, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to a St. Mary Mead farmer whose debts had driven him to sabotage a rival's crop, his desperation a silent poison. Hargreaves, she suspected, was not so different. Hargreaves' Antiquities was as dim and cluttered as before, its shelves heavy with brass lamps and faded porcelain, but the air felt charged, as if the relics sensed the tension. Hargreaves stood behind his counter, his ruddy face paler than Miss Marple remembered, his hands fidgeting with a silver spoon. "Miss Marple, Inspector," he said, his voice a forced boom. "More questions, I suppose. I've told you all I know." His eyes darted to Craddock, then back to the spoon, and Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his fingers. She smiled, settling onto a creaky stool, her knitting bag at her feet. "Just a few points to clarify, Mr. Hargreaves," she said, her tone as warm as a vicarage tea. "You were so certain about the goblet's authenticity, or lack thereof. I wondered if you'd learned anything new since we last spoke." Her needles emerged, clicking softly, a rhythm that seemed to unsettle him. Hargreaves's jaw tightened, and he set the spoon down with a clink. "Nothing new," he said, his voice gruff. "It's a fake. I'd stake my reputation on it. Wren was a fraud, inflating its value to cheat honest collectors. I told him so, and he laughed in my face." His face flushed, and Miss Marple saw the spark of anger in his eyes, the same fire Clara had described from their argument. And yet, she said, her voice gentle, "You were seen near his shop that night, long after you said you were home. Mrs. Gibbs, you know she has such sharp eyes." She tilted her head, her expression one of mild curiosity. But her gaze was unwavering, catching the sudden pallor in his cheeks. Hargreaves's hand jerked, knocking the spoon to the floor. "Mrs. Gibbs is mistaken," he blustered, bending to retrieve it. "I was home, like I said. She must have seen someone else." But his voice faltered, and Miss Marple noted the fresh bandage on his hand, covering the cut she'd seen before. It was small, but telling, like a St. Mary Mead thief who'd scratched himself on a stolen brooch. "Perhaps," she said, her needles pausing. "But it's so easy to be mistaken, about times, isn't it? And that goblet's such a pity it's gone. If it was a fake, as you say, why steal it?" She leaned forward slightly, her eyes holding his. "Unless, of course, someone wanted to prove a point or hide something else." Hargreaves's face darkened, and he leaned across the counter, his voice low. "Look here, Miss Marple, I didn't kill Wren. I wanted that goblet to show he was a liar, yes, but I didn't need to kill him for it. I'd have bought it, had it tested, exposed him." His words were fierce, but his eyes flicked to the door, as if expecting Craddock's men to burst in. Miss Marple nodded, her smile serene. "Of course," she said, but her mind was busy, stitching together the clues. The cut, the wax, the false alibi. Hargreaves was unraveling, his bluster a thin thread. She recalled his walking stick, its waxed handle a match for the smudge in Wren's shop, and the debt that pressed him like a vice. "One last thing," she said, rising. "That cut on your hand, it's healing nicely, I see. From a vase, you said." "Aye," Hargreaves muttered, his hand retreating behind the counter. "Clumsy customer, like I told you." But his eyes avoided hers, and Miss Marple's lips twitched faintly. She thought of a St. Mary Mead boy who'd lied about a cut. From a knife, his guilt betrayed by his shifting gaze. As they left the shop, Craddock's face was grim. "He's lying about that night," he said, starting the car. "Mrs. Gibbs is certain it was him, and his housekeeper's story doesn't hold up. She can't swear he was home past 8. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts on the wax smudge. The goblets, papers, the desperation in Hargreaves's voice. The pattern was tightening, each stitch pulling the truth closer. Back in her parlor, as the fire crackled and Cherry brought a tray of scones, Miss Marple spread her knitting and sipped her tea. "They're saying Hargreaves was seen with a London man again," Cherry said, her voice hushed. "Mrs. Price swears it was about money, not antiques." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed in the firelight. A debt, a lie, a waxed stick. The tapestry was nearly complete, and Hargreaves's slip was the thread that might unravel it all. Chapter 10. The alibi crumbles. The village of St. Mary Mead lay hushed under a veil of morning fog. Its cottages and shops softened into ghostly shapes as Miss Jane Marple walked briskly toward the Red Lion pub. Her black handbag swung at her side, and her mind, as sharp as the chill in the air, was piecing together the threads of Percival Wren's murder. Inspector Craddock's latest findings, shared over a crackling telephone line, had sharpened her focus on Thomas Wren, the victim's estranged son, whose shaky alibi and sullen demeanor were fraying under scrutiny. Miss Marple, with her knack for seeing through the masks of human nature, felt the pattern of the crime tightening, each clue a stitch drawing the truth closer. The pub's interior was quiet in the morning light, its tables empty save for a few early patrons nursing their tea. Thomas Wren slouched in the same corner booth where she'd met him before, his lanky frame hunched over a mug of coffee, his eyes bloodshot and wary. The barman Jim polished glasses at the counter, his glance flickering toward them with idle curiosity. Miss Marple settled opposite Thomas, her knitting bag resting on the table, her smile as gentle as a vicarage tea. "Good morning, Thomas," she said, her voice soft but carrying the weight of intent. "I thought we might have another chat. These are such troubling times." Thomas's jaw tightened, and he pushed his mug aside, his fingers drumming on the table. "Troubling, aye," he muttered, his voice rough with fatigue, or something deeper. "Police been at me again, saying I wasn't here when I said I was. You believe them, I suppose?" His tone was defiant, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of unease in his eyes, like a St. Mary Mead youth caught in a lie about a broken window. Her needles emerged, clicking softly as she began a new row. "I believe in listening, my dear," she said, her eyes meeting his with quiet intensity. "And the truth has a way of showing itself. You said you were here at the Red Lion until 10 the night your father died. But Jim, you see, remembers things differently." She tilted her head toward the barman, who was now wiping the counter with studied indifference. Thomas's fingers stilled, and his gaze darted to Jim, then back to Miss Marple. "He's wrong," he said, his voice sharp. "I was here, drinking, with the lads. Ask anyone." But his words lacked force, and Miss Marple noted the way his shoulders hunched, as if bracing for a blow. She recalled a St. Mary Mead boy who'd sworn he was at a dance, only for a neighbor to spot him skulking elsewhere. Alibis, she knew, were fragile things, easily unraveled by a single thread. "Jim says, you left earlier," she said, her tone as mild as if discussing the weather. "Perhaps around 9. It's so easy to lose track of time in a busy pub." Her needles paused, and she leaned forward slightly, her eyes holding his. "And the lane behind the church you said you took it home. It passes your father's shop, doesn't it? The back window is quite visible from there." Thomas's face paled, and he rubbed his hands together, his knuckles whitening. "I didn't go near the shop," he said, his voice low but urgent. "I told you, I went straight home. Needed to clear my head after everything." His eyes flicked away, and Miss Marple saw the strain in his jaw, the same tension she'd seen in a young man who'd stolen to settle a debt, his guilt, a heavy shadow. She nodded, her expression serene but her mind alert. "Of course," she said, "but it's such a small village. People notice things, Mrs. Elton. For instance, she mentioned seeing a car parked oddly near the shop that night. Mr. Hargreaves's car, she thought. She watched Thomas closely, noting the slight flinch at Hargreaves's name. "Did you ever see him about? Perhaps watching the shop?" Thomas hesitated, his fingers tracing the rim of his mug. "Hargreaves. Maybe once or twice," he said at last, his voice grudging. "He was always sniffing around, jealous of father's finds. I saw him a few days before, standing across the street, staring at the window where that goblet was. Looked like he wanted to smash it." His tone was bitter, and Miss Marple wondered if the anger was for Hargreaves or his father or both. Her needles resumed their rhythm, a steady counterpoint to the pub's quiet hum. "That goblet," she said, her voice thoughtful. "It meant so much to your father. Did he ever share its secrets with you? About its buyer, perhaps, or its authenticity?" She recalled the papers in Wren's desk, the note questioning the goblets, silver, and wondered if Thomas knew more than he let on. He shook his head, his eyes darkening. "He didn't tell me anything, just went on about its value, how it'd make his name. I told him to sell it, clear some debts mine included, but he wouldn't listen. Said it was his legacy." His voice cracked, and for a moment, Miss Marple saw not a suspect, but a boy, wounded by a father's rejection. She thought of a St. Mary Mead son who'd quarreled over an inheritance, his anger masking a deeper hurt. "You must have felt very alone," she said, her voice warm with sympathy. "Family quarrels are so painful." Her eyes held his, gentle but probing, and Thomas's shoulders slumped, his defiance crumbling like a poorly knit stitch. "I just wanted him to see me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not as a failure, but as his son. I wandered by the shop that night, yes, but I didn't go in. Saw a light, Thought he was working late. Kept walking. His admission hung in the air, and Miss Marple's lips pursed faintly. A light in the shop, a son's confession, these were new threads, tightening the pattern. Before she could press further, Craddock entered, his face grim. "Miss Marple, a word," he said, nodding toward Thomas. She rose, thanking Thomas for his time, her smile as kind as ever, but her mind racing. Outside, Craddock shared his latest find, Mrs. Elton's stories shifting. She admits now she drove by the shop around 9, saw Hargreaves's car parked in the lane. Says she didn't stop, just noticed it. He rubbed his neck, his eyes narrowing. And Jim just confirmed Thomas left the pub closer to 8:30, not 10. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed in the foggy light. "How very interesting," she said, her thoughts on Thomas's admission, Hargreaves's car, the wax smudge near the dagger's case. The alibis were crumbling, like a scarf unraveling at the edges. She recalled a St. Mary Mead mystery, where a single witness's glance had broken a case wide open. "We must look closer at that car," she said, her voice soft but firm, "and perhaps ask Mrs. Elton why she was driving by at all." Back in her parlor that evening, as the fire cast a warm glow, Miss Marple spread her knitting and sipped her tea. Cherry, bringing a tray of biscuits, chattered about the village's whispers. "They're saying Thomas was seen near the shop after all," she said, her eyes wide, "and Mrs. Elton's been acting odd, avoiding folk." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her mind weaving the final threads. Thomas's lie, Hargreaves's presence, Mrs. Elton's nerves. The tapestry was nearly complete, and one stitch would unravel it all. Chapter 11. The final clue. The pale light of a November morning filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's parlor, casting delicate patterns on the polished floor. She sat by the fire, her knitting spread across her lap, the cream wool, a soft contrast to the sharp clarity of her thoughts. The murder of Percival Wren had woven a complex tapestry in her mind, and now, with Inspector Craddock's latest findings and her own observations, the final threads were falling into place. Her needles lay idle, her hands resting lightly on the yarn, as she turned over the clues. The wax smudge near the dagger's case, the scuff mark by the storeroom, Thomas Wren's crumbling alibi, Mrs. Elton's nervous admission, and Mr. Hargreaves's mounting desperation. Each was a stitch, and Miss Marple was certain the pattern was nearly complete. She had asked Craddock to meet her at Wren's shop once more, sensing that the scene of the crime held one last secret. As she stepped through the door, the brass bell jangled faintly, a mournful echo in the silent space. The air was heavy with the scent of old wood and dust, the shelves of relics standing like silent sentinels. Craddock was already there, his lean frame bent over the oak desk, a constable at his side dusting a corner of the dagger's display case. "Miss Marple," he greeted, straightening. "You were right about the wax. Found traces on the floor near the case, and a bit more by the storeroom door. Matches the type Hargreaves uses on his walking stick beeswax, polished to a shine." Miss Marple's lips twitched faintly, her eyes gleaming behind her spectacles. "How very careless," she murmured, her voice as soft as a vicarage whisper. She moved to the display case, its glass gleaming faintly in the dim light. The dagger was gone, stored as evidence, but the case bore a faint smudge of wax, almost invisible against the polished wood. She leaned closer, her gloved fingers hovering over the spot. "A man in a hurry," she said, "might not notice such a small thing." She thought of a St. Mary Mead thief who'd left a trail of wax from a candle, his haste betraying him to a watchful neighbor. Craddock nodded, his notebook open. "We've got more on Hargreaves," he said, his voice low. His housekeeper's cracked admits he wasn't home past 8 that night, and the London dealer confirmed Hargreaves inquired about the goblet's buyer, trying to outbid them. He was desperate. All right, debts piling up, shop on the brink. He gestured to the empty stand where the goblet had rested. If he thought it was real, he might have killed for it. If he thought it was fake, maybe he wanted to ruin Ren's name. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the storeroom door, where the scuff mark still lingered, a faint scar on the floor. Or perhaps, she said, her tone thoughtful, he took it to hide the real motive. She stepped to the door, her eyes tracing the mark's curve, as if a heavy boot or a stick had paused there. Someone entered this shop knowing exactly what they wanted, she said. The dagger was no random choice. It was in a locked case, yet the key was in Mr. Wren's pocket. The killer was familiar with this place or with Mr. Wren himself. Craddock raised an eyebrow, his pen pausing. You're thinking Hargreaves let himself in, or Wren let him in? He frowned, glancing at the desk, where the scattered papers and broken quill still lay. No sign of a struggle, though, just that one clean thrust. Miss Marple nodded, her mind weaving through the scene. She pictured Hargreaves, his florid face flushed with rage, confronting Wren over the goblet. A heated word, a moment of fury, the dagger seized from its case. Perhaps Wren himself had unlocked it, unaware of the danger. The wax smudge, she thought, was the key, left by Hargreaves's stick as he moved swiftly to cover his tracks. She recalled a St. Mary Mead gardener who'd left a muddy boot print, his crime undone by a single careless step. Have you searched Mr. Hargreaves's shop? She asked, her voice mild but pointed. For the goblet, I mean. We're planning to, Craddock said, jotting a note. Got a warrant this morning. If he's got it hidden, we'll find it. He paused, then added, Mrs. Elton's been talking too. Says she saw Hargreaves's car parked near the shop around 9, and swears she saw a light inside, like someone moving about. She's nervous, keeps changing her story about why she was there. Miss Marple's lips pursed faintly, her thoughts. Oh, and Mrs. Elton's flustered demeanor, the silver spoon in her parlor. Nervous people often see more than they admit, she said, her eyes drifting to the empty stand. And Thomas's admission about wandering near the shop that night. Did he mention anything else? Craddock shook his head. Just that he saw a light, like he told you. Won't say more, but he's shaken. We're checking his Detzo's money to some rough types in Lower Mead, but no evidence he was in the shop. He rubbed his neck, his face grim. Clarice, sticking to her story, locked up at 6, didn't return till morning. No prints on the dagger or the stand, just that wax. Miss Marple moved to the desk, her eyes lingering on the broken quill. Its tip snapped, as if in anger. She pictured Wren, alone with his ledgers, confronted by a familiar face Hargreaves. Perhaps, his stick tapping the floor, his voice rising, over the goblet's worth. The wax, the cut on his hand, the false alibi all pointed to him. Yet Miss Marple felt a niggling doubt, like a dropped stitch in her knitting. Clara's fear, Mrs. Elton's nerves, Thomas's grief each played a part. But Hargreaves's desperation was the brightest thread. Inspector, she said, turning to him, when you search Mr. Hargreaves's shop, look for anything waxed, his stick, perhaps, or a cloth he might have used. In the goblet's papers, have you traced the buyer yet? Her voice was gentle, but her eyes were sharp, catching the flicker of interest in Craddock's face. The dealer's still cagey, he admitted, but we're pressing him. Says the buyer was anonymous, paid through a bank in London. We'll get there. He closed his notebook, his expression resolute. You've got a theory, haven't you, Miss Marple? She smiled, her hands folding over her bag. Oh, just a pattern, Inspector, but it's nearly complete. She thought of a St. Mary Mead mystery, where a single clue-smudged fingerprint had unraveled a web of lies. The wax smudge was her fingerprint, and Hargreaves was its source. As she stepped into the misty street, her mind was clear. The goblet's theft was a mask, the murder a moment of rage, and the final clue had tied the threads together. Back in her parlor that evening, as the fire crackled and Cherry set out a tray of tea, Miss Marple spread her knitting and sipped thoughtfully. They're saying the police are at Hargreaves's shop now, Cherry said, her voice hushed with excitement. Mrs. Price saw them go in, looking grim. "Reckon they'll find that goblet." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her thoughts on the wax, the stick, the man whose desperation had undone him. The tapestry was complete, and the truth was ready to be unveiled. Chapter 12. The truth unraveled. The vicarage drawing room was a haven of quiet warmth, its windows framing the soft gray of a November afternoon in St. Mary Mead. A fire crackled in the grate, casting a glow on the polished furniture and the silver tea service that Mrs. Clement had arranged with care. Miss Jane Marple sat in a high-backed chair, her knitting folded neatly in her lap, her eyes bright behind her spectacles as she surveyed the gathered suspects. Clara Phelps, her face pale and drawn. Mr. Hargreaves, his ruddy complexion sallow with strain. Mrs. Elton, fidgeting with a lace handkerchief, and Thomas Wren, his lanky frame tense, his eyes shadowed with unease. Inspector Craddock stood by the mantel, his notebook tucked away, his expression one of quiet authority as he nodded to Miss Marple to begin. "My dear friends," Miss Marple said, her voice as gentle as the rustle of leaves, "this has been a troubling time for St. Mary Mead. Poor Mr. Wren's death has left us all shaken, but the truth, like a well-knit scarf, has a way of coming together when the threads are carefully joined." Her hands rested lightly on her knitting, her gaze moving from one face to another, noting Clara's trembling lips, Hargreaves's clenched jaw, Mrs. Elton's nervous flutter, and Thomas's hunched shoulders. She thought of a St. Mary Mead scandal where a single truth had unraveled a web of deceit, and she knew the moment had come to lay bare the pattern. She leaned forward slightly, her tone calm but unwavering. The murder of Mr. Wren was no random act. The dagger, taken from a locked case, and the Elizabethan goblet, stolen so deliberately, pointed to someone who knew the shop intimately or Mr. Wren himself. At first it seemed a theft gone wrong, but the clues told a different story. She paused, her eyes resting on Hargreaves, whose hands gripped the arms of his chair. The goblet's absence was a distraction, meant to mask a deeper motive, but small things, a scuff mark, a broken quill, a smudge of wax betrayed the truth. Clara's breath caught, and Mrs. Elton's handkerchief twisted tighter. Miss Marple continued, her voice soft but clear. "Clara, you loved your work with Mr. Wren, didn't you? Your devotion was plain, but so was your fear. You locked the shop at 6, as you said, and I believe you. Your distress was real, not the mask of a guilty heart." Clara's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, her hands clasped tightly. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Mrs. Elton. "Mrs. Elton, your visits to the shop were frequent, your admiration for Mr. Wren's stories, almost a passion. You saw Mr. Hargreaves's car that night, didn't you? But your nerves made you falter, unsure what you'd witnessed." Mrs. Elton flushed, her voice a whisper. "I didn't mean to hide it. I was just passing by." Miss Marple nodded, her smile gentle but her mind sharp, recalling a St. Mary Mead widow whose half-truths had clouded a theft. "And Thomas," she said, turning to the young man, whose eyes met hers with a mix of defiance and grief. "Your quarrel with your father was painful, your debts a heavy burden. You wandered near the shop that night, saw a light, but you didn't enter. Your heart was sore, but not murderous." Thomas's shoulders slumped, and he looked away, his hands unclenching. Miss Marple thought of a St. Mary Mead youth whose anger had masked a longing for reconciliation, and she knew Thomas was no killer. Her gaze settled on Hargreaves, whose face had grown ashen. "Mr. Hargreaves," she said, her voice steady, "you wanted the goblet, didn't you? Not because you believed it was real, but to prove Mr. Wren a frauder, to sell it to save your failing shop. Your debts were crushing, your envy a fire that burned for years. You argued with Mr. Wren that day, and later, you returned." She paused, her eyes holding his. "Mrs. Gibbs saw you near the shop at 9:30, not home as you claimed. Your housekeeper couldn't swear to your presence. And the wax on your walking sticks, such a distinctive polish left its mark by the dagger's case. Hargreaves's hands shook, and he rose, his voice a hoarse protest. This is nonsense. I didn't kill him. I wanted the goblet, yes, to show he was a liar. But I didn't. His words faltered as Craddock stepped forward, holding a small bundle wrapped in cloth. We found this in your shop, Mr. Hargreaves, Craddock said, unwrapping the Elizabethan goblet, its silver gleaming despite the dim light, hidden in a locked chest, along with a cloth stained with wax. And this, he held up a heavy walking stick, its handle polished to a shine, traces of beeswax still clinging to it. Hargreaves collapsed into his chair, his face crumpling. I didn't mean to kill him, he whispered, his voice breaking. I went to confront him, to demand the goblet's papers. He laughed, called me a failure. The dagger was there. In his hand he'd unlocked the case to show it off. I lost my temper, grabbed it, struck him. The goblet I took it to make it look like a theft. His words spilled out, a confession torn from a man whose pride had shattered. Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her resolve was firm. Anger is a dangerous thing, she said, her voice gentle. It blinds us, like a storm over a quiet village. She thought of a St. Mary Mead man who'd lashed out in rage, his life undone by a moment's fury. You wanted to ruin Mr. Wren, but you destroyed yourself, Craddock signaled to his constable, who led Hargreaves away, his shoulders bowed under the weight of his guilt, and Thomas stared at the floor, his face a mask of relief and sorrow. Miss Marple folded her hands, her knitting untouched. As Mrs. Clement bustled in with fresh tea, her chatter a soft balm to the room's tension, as the suspects dispersed, Miss Marple remained, her thoughts drifting to the goblet, now restored, to its stand in Wren's shop. Its secret, whether fake or genuine, mattered less than the truth it had unveiled. She recalled a St. Mary Mead mystery, where a single clue, a misplaced letter, had revealed the killer's heart. Here, the wax smudge had been enough. Back in her parlor that evening, as the fire cast its glow, and Cherry set out a tray of scones, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking steadily. They're saying Hargreaves confessed to everything, Cherry said, her eyes wide. Mrs. Price can't believe it was him all along. Miss Marple smiled, her thoughts on the tapestry now complete, its threads of envy, desperation, and rage woven into a truth that had restored the village's peace.